apprehension seems to exist among the people of the southern states that by the accession of a Republican administration, their property and their peace and personal security are to be endangered. There has never been any reasonable cause for such apprehension. Indeed, the most ample evidence to the contrary has all the while existed and been open to their inspection. It is found in nearly all of the published speeches of him who now addresses you. No state upon its own mere motivation can lawfully get out of the Union. That resolves and ordinances to that effect are legally void, and that acts of violence within any state or states against the authority of the United States are insurrectionary or revolutionary, according to circumstances. We are not enemies but friends. We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection. The mystic cords of memory, stretching from every battlefield and patriot grave to every living heart and heart stone, all over this broad land, will yet swell the chorus of the Union, when again touched, as surely they will be, by the better angels of our nature. Abraham Lincoln delivered these words in his first inaugural address, speaking in front of the half-assembled Capitol Rotunda, in front of thousands of eager listeners, on March 4th, 1861. This is Henry Wilson and the Civil War. Inauguration Day was raw and harsh, with heavy rain and cold winds greeting the new president, weather that was emblematic of the political conditions of the nation. Henry Wilson was in the crowd, and was likely as impressed by Lincoln's first inaugural as was most of the men in attendance, including Lincoln's rival, Stephen Douglas. In his first address as president, Lincoln referred to the South without contempt and argued against secession. The speech not only pleaded for the South not to attempt to secede, but also served as an argument against the legal principle of secession. Both Lincoln and Wilson held the same view, that secession was not a concept within the realm of the Constitution of the United States. Once a state entered into the Union, it could never be released, or, in the case at hand, release itself. The United States was one consolidated nation, and as different as states may be, they were not sovereign. Southern secessionists obviously held a view contrary to Lincoln's and Wilson's. Secessionists believed that states had a right to depart from the Union if the promises within the Constitution were broken. Up to the point of Lincoln's inauguration, President Buchanan had stood idly by as disunion occurred. In his final State of the Union to Congress in 1861, Buchanan argued against secession while also arguing in favor of why the South was doing it, believing that the federal government shouldn't attempt to use force to stop the rebellion. In the final months, Buchanan's administration fractured, with some Southern members acting on behalf of Southern interests, allocating weapons and resources to important posts in the South, in the fear that violence would break out. Failure to even try to squash rebellion, along with his strong support for the institution of slavery, through his support of the Lecompton Constitution earlier in his presidency, Buchanan is today regarded as the worst president in U.S. history. Whether or not secession was constitutional, the Southern slave states had already jumped ship. The nation was in the midst of chaos, and still how the nation would endure and solve the struggle was unknown. Most secessionists knew that Northerners would likely be enraged by their disunion, but they ultimately thought that the Union wouldn't take any strong militaristic steps to stop it. Despite most Southerners desiring to uphold the institution of slavery, not all wanted to leave the Union. Sam Houston, the governor of Texas, knew what would come as states departed from the Union. In a speech urging Texas to vote against secession, Houston said, quote, "Some of you laugh to scorn the idea of bloodshed as a result of secession, but let me tell you what is coming. Your fathers and husbands, your sons and brothers, will be herded at the point of the bayonet. You may, after the sacrifice of countless millions of treasures and hundreds of thousands of lives, as a bare possibility, win Southern independence, but I doubt it. I tell you that, while I believe with you in the doctrine of states' rights, the North is determined to preserve this Union. They are not a fiery, impulsive people as you are, for they live in colder climates. But when they begin to move in a given direction, they move with the steady momentum and perseverance of a mighty avalanche. And what I fear is they will overwhelm the South." End quote. It seemed the one thing Northerners and Southerners agreed on was that any bloodshed wouldn't be drastic, and the conflict would be speedily resolved, a naive view in hindsight. Though Wilson carried a similar sentiment in his belief that any military conflict wasn't likely to be as destructive as it turned out to be, he frantically got to work building a strong army. As the new chairman of the Military Affairs Committee, he held the responsibility to write legislation to assess, raise, and fund an army. At the start of the year, the army had a strength of about 18,000 men. Wilson quickly came to realize that this wouldn't be enough to engage in any impending conflict with the fervent Southerners. Early on, Wilson had called on Lincoln to raise many more men than was planned, though until conflict actually broke out, this call went unanswered. Before we go any further, we need to look at the Lincoln administration. In the weeks and months following the election, hundreds poured into Abraham Lincoln's Illinois office to seek patronage. It was essential that Lincoln chose the right men for the critical positions during this critical time. In January, Wilson wrote to Lincoln from the Senate chamber and said, quote, "The times are critical, and our friends are anxious to have the firmest and ablest men of the country in your cabinet. This is my only excuse for troubling you with this note." End quote. As was true at the convention in the summer of 1860, the Republican Party was a delicate association of anti-slavery men. Their bonds with each other were not strong, and any slight could fracture the entire party. Lincoln knew that whoever was given a seat in his administration would need to balance the many factions of the party, so he looked to his rivals. 5 of Lincoln's 8 cabinet secretaries had been his opponents in the Republican nomination of 1860. For his Secretary of State, Lincoln chose his former rival, William Seward, his Secretary of Treasury, Salmon Chase, Secretary of War, Simon Cameron, although Cameron would quickly be replaced with Edwin Stanton, someone Henry Wilson would work closely with as the chair of the Military Committee. While America was still waiting to see how the tumultuous events of 1861 would play out, the nation was brought to a realization of what the coming days would bring as the first shots of the Civil War were fired at Fort Sumter in South Carolina. When South Carolina seceded in December 1860, the newly independent and brash government got to work planning how to effectively take over the federally controlled forts in the state. In December, South Carolina demanded that the U.S. abandon their post in Charleston Harbor, which Fort Sumter sat at the entrance of. Major Robert Anderson, who was posted in a facility in Charleston Harbor, secretly moved his supplies to Fort Sumter in an effort to get a better position against the belligerents planning on invading the Union installments. Major Anderson was a Southerner whose sympathies greatly lied with the South, though because of his years in service for the United States, he felt his allegiance with preserving and protecting the nation overrode his Southern pride. In one of his only good decisions in his final days, in fact, in his entire presidency, President Buchanan moved to reinforce Major Anderson with protection and supplies. From December to April, the rebels slowly prepared to make a siege upon the fort, still being held by Major Anderson. When the Confederate Army was formed in March, Brigadier General P.G.T. Beauregard was placed in command of Charleston Harbor and quickly sought to reinforce weapons against Major Anderson and prepare for an overtaking of Fort Sumter. In April, President Lincoln prepared to send supplies to Major Anderson as his resources were quickly depleting. Lincoln sent a message to South Carolina that a Union ship would be delivering supplies, to which Major General Beauregard responded by ordering an immediate evacuation of the fort, to which Major Anderson refused. Early in the morning on April 12th, Confederate reinforcements began to attack the fort in an effort to overrun Anderson and take control. After 34 hours of gunfighting, the scarcely equipped Anderson was quickly outpaced, and the Union was forced into surrendering Fort Sumter, giving the first victory in the war against the rebellion to the Confederate Army. Following the attack at Sumter, it became clear to everyone in Washington that the time had come to strengthen the Army to match the quickly amassing power of the South. Lincoln needed to work closely with Wilson to legislate an army into fruition. A week after Fort Sumter, Wilson wrote a letter to Lincoln, which in full read, quote, "When I returned home after the executive session, I found nearly all the people sore, sad, and disheartened. It seemed as if your administration was destined to go down before its career began. At the time your proclamation was issued after the fall of Sumter, the people were full of complaints. And when I went to Washington 3 weeks ago, they were anything but satisfied with the management of affairs. On my return home this week, I find everyone hopeful, confident, satisfied. Today, our friends are full of confidence in you and your cabinet. The change in 3 weeks is very marked and most gratifying, and I am sure the people are for prompt and earnest action. They now feel that you are doing the right thing and that all will be done in your power to put down treason." End quote. Wilson originally pushed Lincoln to support calling for 300,000 troops to reinforce the Union Army, though Wilson's advice was ignored for seeming too alarmist, with Lincoln calling for just 75,000 new volunteers. Wilson brought Harriet back to Natick and spent most of his time traveling from Washington to Massachusetts, working to not only manage the military affairs of the nation, but also build a strong state militia. Along with his role in the Senate, Wilson's title as a military colonel suited him well. Wilson's connections in the state militia proved useful when the time came to supply the Army with the needed resources to fight the impending war. Here again is U.S. Senate historian Betty Coed.
This time period from, say, November to April, when the war actually begins, is a fascinating time in Senate history because it's a time before the war has actually begun, but the Senate is preparing for the war that will come. And in the wake of secession, the members like Henry Wilson, there were others, Zachary Taylor from Michigan, there were many of them, Lincoln, Stephen Douglas of Illinois. Many of them went back to their home states and worked to build armies and to recruit militias in their home states to support the Union cause. And then they come back to Washington early in 1861, February, March of 1861. The session was about to begin in March of 1861 for a brief time period. In those days, the Senate ended a session in March and then was usually out of session until the following December. But in that year, they were here until March with a session, and then they went out of session and were called back into an emergency session by Abraham Lincoln in July. But that time period from January to July is a time when senators are very active in preparing for the war. They're looking at ways they can fund the war. They're looking what sort of bills that have to be passed to create to raise an army, to establish conscription, to find a way to pay soldiers, to find a way to arm soldiers, all of the things that they knew would be necessities for the war that was about to come. And so it's a very active period, but it's also a very traumatic period because they've seen their colleagues of many years walk out. and there left this divided Senate facing the crisis of war.
General Winfield Scott, a veteran of nearly every war from the War of 1812 through the Civil War, remarked that in the early months of the crisis, Wilson had worked harder than he had in his decades of service. Lincoln looked to General Scott to formulate a strategy to bring the war to a quick end. Though like Wilson, Scott also saw the potential for the conflict to be much greater than projected. And so his plan was ambitious, proposing a siege around the South in order to blockade their ports and strangle them into compliance, calling his strategy the Anaconda Plan for its strangling quality. Not 3 months after the fall of Fort Sumter did the slowly pressing war come right to Washington's doorstep. The Confederate capital was in Richmond, Virginia, just over 100 miles from Washington, D.C., the capital of the Union. Both Northerners and Southerners believed their adversaries wouldn't have the stamina to fight a long war. Northerners viewed Southerners as stupid and lazy, lacking the resources to take on the U.S. Army, and Southerners viewed Northerners as pampered, weak, and not tough enough to take on the aggressive Southern fighters. Both sides believed that the conflict would come to an end quick if the opposing capital was captured, so both armies devised a plan to capture D.C. and Richmond respectively. On July 21, 1861, the first formal battle of the Civil War began as Union troops descended towards Richmond, where the first meeting of the Confederate legislature would commence. Tens of thousands of eager Northern men gathered in the capital to march from Washington to Richmond to assist in the restoration of the Union. The soldiers, who had very little, if any, formal training, began their over 7-hour journey, greeted by the celebration of supporters in the streets. Many Washington socialites cheered the men on, with many even following them to watch the battle, bringing along food and drinks to picnic during what they assumed would be a swift victory. Among those riding behind the men was Senator Wilson, who intended on supplying the men with food and acting as a supervisor in his military role. After many hours of traveling, the soldiers took a break in Centerville, Virginia, not far from the Manassas Railroad Junction and close to the Bull Run River. Inexperienced Brigadier General Irwin McDowell moved his men across the river, where they encountered Confederate troops who were camped out at the railroad junction. The Confederates were in a much better position militarily, allowing for a bombardment of the Union fighters by cannons and guns. Though the Union at first greatly outnumbered the Confederate belligerents, Confederates quickly moved in reinforcements from the railroad, which was aligned very well with the rebels' position. Both sides were very inexperienced and disorganized, though the Confederates put up a strong fight and refused to back down, causing the Union to retreat. Both armies were not sufficiently trained or equipped, with both sides not having proper uniforms or distinct flags to mark which side was which, leading to further chaos and confusion. As the battle escalated, the many Washington socialites who had gathered to essentially picnic during the fight retreated as well, with many getting their carriages destroyed by cannon fire, including Henry Wilson's. Gossip had it that upon seeing his carriage destroyed, Wilson frantically ran from the scene, begging anyone he could to give him a ride. In a 1960 book, A Civil War Treasury of Tales, Legends, and Folklore by Benjamin Albert Botkin, the tale of Wilson fleeing from Bull Run was recounted. Quote, Henry Wilson, a senator and afterwards vice president of the United States, begged in vain of a teamster the privilege of a seat on his wagon. After repeated and emphatic refusals, he revealed his name and position. I am Henry Wilson, said he, United States Senator. But the teamster, perfectly unmoved by the announcement of the dignity and importance of his petitioner, cried out, I don't care who you are, and lashing his mules, sped on his way. End quote. Wilson and others were there recalled a different version of events, where he safely rode away from Bull Run to Centerville, and then got a ride back to D.C. from a Pennsylvanian after walking part of the way. The story of Wilson's frantic escape from Bull Run was spread by Kentucky Senator Garrett Davis, with Wilson becoming a symbol of Northern cowardice, bolstering their victorious attitude following the win at Bull Run. President Lincoln also got a good laugh at Wilson's supposed flee from the scene, joking that Wilson reacted like a horse when a shot is fired. It seems likely that Wilson probably did run from the scene in a hurried manner, and was likely embarrassed by his mad dash away from the chaotic scene. When he arrived back to Massachusetts, he was frantic and spread word that Washington was likely to fall to Confederate forces without the adequate support for the disheveled Union Army. In the battle, a combined 4,690 men on both sides had either been killed, injured, or were missing, 6 times worse than the U.S. loss at the largest battle of the Mexican-American War just 14 years earlier.
But when the war does begin, and the first skirmishes of the war, the most notably the first Battle of Bull Run that happens in 1861, and then later that summer we get the Battle of Ball's Bluff, both of which are huge Union defeats. And that prompts Congress to create what was known as the Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War. And this joint committee met to explore all aspects of the war, and it continued to meet throughout the war years into 1865. And they held hundreds of hearings. They went to many different locations, and they looked at such things as military preparedness, the effectiveness of military weapons. They looked at prisoners of war and how prisoners of war were treated. They even looked at issues of how the war affected Native Americans and this kind of stuff. And they produced these many volumes of reports that are really a key source for historians now who are studying the Civil War era.
When back in Washington, Wilson got to work legislating the raising of troops and supporting Congress's push for Lincoln to call for more than 500,000 longer-term men to serve. Coming to the realization that the temporary adjustments would not be adequate for a war which could go on for years. It was unknown how the Union failed so miserably at Bull Run, though history has proved that many of the Union's plans may have been exposed by Southern spy, temptress, and associate of Wilson, Rose Greenhow. In today's episode, although we just covered a few months, we discussed a lot. We covered Lincoln's inauguration and his cabinet, the views surrounding secession, Wilson's early work on the Military Affairs Committee, the first battle of the war at Fort Sumter, the raising of troops, and then the Battle of Bull Run, which is also known as the First Battle of Bull Run or the First Battle of Manassas in the South. We closed on Rose Greenhow, who we'll start with in the next episode. This was the first episode where we looked at some of the military battles. Most of my knowledge of the war is on the political side of things, so despite my many attempts to fully understand and recount the military history of the battles, I'm sure I'll have some shortcomings, so please let me know if I get something wrong by sending me an email at HenryWilsonPodcast@gmail.com, and I'll correct any mistakes I make in future episodes. There is so much interesting information about the battles of the war that we just won't be able to cover, so if you find these battle stories interesting, I encourage you to check out some of the other great podcasts that deal with the battles of the war. Be sure to check out HenryWilsonHistory.com for more information on Wilson's life and some interesting images from the period. Thank you so much for listening. If you have any questions or comments, please email them to HenryWilsonPodcast@gmail.com. I can't wait to continue through the story of the Civil War through the lens of Henry Wilson.